Thank you, Power to Fly, for facilitating this awesome conversation. And May, I'm super excited to roll into the next 45 minutes, or a little less actually, so time's going to fly. I just want to say this is a very important conversation, so I invite all of our live callers to stop multitasking. I know that you are pros at that, but let's try to practice some emotional intelligence and be present. And if anyone has any questions that they want to ask our guest speaker, please drop them in the chat box, and I will flag that to our guest speaker so that she can dive in deep there. But Ann Mei, I just want to start off by saying, I know Meg gave a beautiful introduction there, but can you tell us a bit more about your career, personal journey, anything else you want to kick us off with? We'd love to hear more about your personal experiences in the worlds of business, tech, and policy.
Sure. I'll go very quickly, but start at the beginning, which is I was born in New Jersey as a child of immigrants. Went to college moved out to the West Coast to go to college, studied computer science, and then worked in the tech industry for 23 years in both small startup companies as well as some big companies you may have heard of, like Google and Apple and Intuit. Kind of took on increasing levels of responsibility. My last role was a senior engineering director at Google. But then about a decade ago now, I decided to make a shift in my career and spend the second half of my career trying to do something to make the world a better place. And when I looked around at all the problems in the world I cared about, I decided that global poverty was at the root of so many of them. And so I decided to focus on global poverty. And that took me to join government at the State Department and later USAID to work at nonprofits like Mercy Corps, and really went on this journey trying to figure out how, like, all the things I learned from my years in Silicon Valley could be applicable to, like, trying to end global poverty, which was a pretty big shift from what I was doing before. Since I left USAID at the end of the Obama administration, I wrote this book, Clean Impact, that tried to capture a lot of what I learned. And then, more recently, had this fascinating and fun opportunity to join Pete Buttigieg's campaign, which I'd never done before, never done a campaign before. And so that was just such a fun and intense and, like, rewarding experience.
Well, I know you have so much knowledge to drop because of all of these awesome, rewarding experiences that you have, under your belt. So feel free to, flavor this conversation, sharing that knowledge. I know that I'm personally fascinated about your journey and what led you to, highlight or I guess put your focus on, social impact initiatives. That is something that I care about a lot about, and I hope that more folks like us can, listen to that inner voice saying, maybe it's time for me to either pivot in my career or, pick up some other tools so that I can put some of these things into practice. But before we go into some deeper questions here, what led you to write the book Lean Impact? We want to hear a little bit more about that experience.
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned in my when I made this shift in my career, at first I was a little bit lost. I'm like, I've been managing these large teams, building software like Google Maps for your phone, and YouTube and Gmail for your phone, and all these things. And how could this be helpful in ending global poverty? And so, initially what I found was a lot of people were coming to me with looking for tech solutions, right? You're like, can you create an app for me? Can you create a website for me? And I had been so far, it had been so long since I had personally written an app or created a website. In fact, there weren't apps and websites when I learned how to program. That like, it wasn't something I could necessarily personally do. And also, it wasn't clear in a lot of these cases that that's what they needed. And so as I continued to learn more about the work that was happening, what became more and more clear to me is that the challenges that we're trying to tackle in the world, in the social sector and government, particularly in global poverty, are so huge. And the solutions that we have are nowhere near up to what we need. And I think that can be true for any of the issues probably anyone on this Zoom cares about. Is, if you think about the need that's out there and the solutions we have, there's a big mismatch. And what I found is that we're just bringing the wrong tools to the table. I was used to, in Silicon Valley, working on really ambitious projects and things that we didn't know how to do yet, and we used a very different set of tools than the people who were, running a dry cleaner or doing something that, like, exactly what needs to be done and you just do it. And what I found is we were trying to solve global poverty, solve racial injustice with the same tools that you would use for running a dry cleaner, which is something that like exactly what needs to be done, and you just need to do it. And that just wasn't the case. We had, we were working with much greater uncertainty. We had to take much more risk. We had to use a different set of tools that was much more nimble, that allowed for failure, but also allowed us to cast a wider net, to iterate and learn much more quickly, to find our way to a better solution that could be transformative. And so, through my time kind of working in the sector, some of these concepts became more and more clear to me, and that, and I realized that Silicon Valley had, in a sense, really matured these types of tools that are suitable for, taking big risks and for transformative change, and that they could be adapted for social change. And so, the book was really trying to capture that and to sort of build that bridge between that audacity and the tools that Silicon Valley uses for profit, and the audacity and the needs that we're trying to serve in the social sector.
I love that you speak about this being, transformative in the way of, seeking solutions to these really chewy, complex challenges. So thank you for that. I'm curious to hear you just rant a little bit about emotional intelligence, because I'm pretty much obsessed with emotional intelligence. I feel like we have a lot of room to grow there, especially in the world of technology. And I'm wondering, just as you're reflecting on your journey, can you identify maybe where there was a lack of emotional intelligence involved, or maybe, an overwhelming amount involved? Because I find that, in our communities, we see either, we can say the absurdity that a lack of emotional intelligence creates, like lack of empathy, let's say, or lack of self-awareness, or social, social awareness. And so when you're building tools, I find that one of my biggest fears is that we have people building tools with a lack of emotional intelligence, and then what do you use those tools to do? How do you confront these big challenges? So can you please take some time to rant about emotional intelligence?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I would say that while I have seen that be an issue here in the US, when you're talking about global development, all of those challenges are magnified, right? Because it's not only that we're trying to serve disadvantaged people in our own country, we're trying to serve people who are disadvantaged in other countries, from different cultures, from, who have very different experiences. And so Lean Impact really takes its, inspiration from a book called Lean Startup. Which is a sort of Bible in Silicon Valley. And they both have a lot of common ancestry with the concept of human-centered design, which is the idea that we want to put people at the center, and we really need to listen to people, understand their problems from their perspective, and bring a sense of humility to learning what's going to work. And so I think that's very much all about emotional intelligence. I think what I've seen too much in the global development space and across the board in the nonprofit sector is a lot of hubris. Like, we think we know best. We know the solution. We have the answer, and we're going to give you the thing that we think is good for you. And more often than not, it really doesn't work for one reason or another. So, Lean Impact Human-Centered Design is really trying to turn that on its head and start with the idea of listening, to really listen to people, really understand the challenges they're facing from their perspective, not from our perspective. And then as we start designing solutions, bring people along, engage people, get ideas from people who are different than you, who are experiencing the problem in different ways, and then learn from what works. Like, assume that be upfront about the assumptions we're making, and test those assumptions. Don't just assume what you're going to do, what you come up with is going to work, but have the humility to recognize that we're in uncharted territory. If we're trying to do something transformative that hasn't been done before, we're in uncharted territory. We likely don't have the right solution. So go into it with that perspective, and keep your eyes open for both, is it really working, and is there something that could be a lot better?
Absolutely. And I love that you're highlighting the fact that we are pioneering, we're going into this unmarked territory. I often speak about, how we need to be mindful that the digital space is being colonized. And I know that is such a profound thing to say, but it's real. And why do I say that? And probably firsthand from having worked inside for so long in Silicon Valley, that there aren't, people being represented that are creating different pieces of technology. So we automatically have several voices that are left out of the picture. The digital space is being colonized because we have one or two or three or a handful of, different kinds of privileged folks building technology that is supposed to serve on a global scale. My question is, as you've worked over time, based on your work, what have you discovered to be the most pressing social challenges of our time? I know that it's going to be hard to pick one, but can you just maybe pick a couple and just let us unpack that a little bit based on what you've discovered over time?
Yeah, well, I kind of personally chose global poverty as something to focus on. And you could think about global poverty as, global inequity, just the fact that some people have so little and some people have so much. And the people who have so little are suffering. They don't have the opportunity that other people have to get more. And that sort of inequity, that poverty, whatever you call it, is, causes a lot of other bad things to happen, right? And so that's the one that I've personally focused on. It's certainly not the only problem I care about. Global poverty itself is huge, and there are so many other huge problems. But for me, that's been the one that really speaks to me, is at the root of many of the other things I care about.
Yes, and I'm curious to know what you've seen in the space of technology that is intentional, to create some social impact, not the self-righteous impact, that you're saying, yeah, I can create things because I can, and I got this, cool degree, and I've got all these, these experiences under my belt, and I'm going to do it because I can, and crossing fingers that it works, but going for your way of like testing it and being upfront, being real, seeing if you are actually making impact. Who else do you see in the space, making these kinds of intentional moves? I'm not asking you to call anyone out, but who do you look up to in the space? Where is there room to grow? I know that you're specifically focused on poverty, on global poverty, but what do you see happening in the space? Because I know we've got some people listening who want to join or who want to figure out how to become involved. And so who would you like to highlight in the space of social impact and technology?
Yeah, well, first of all, I have, since I left USAID and started writing the book, I've been focused also on a number of things domestically as well. So I haven't only been focused on global poverty, and I also don't only focus on technology. In fact, most of the time I try to steer people away from focusing on technology, because I think when you start with the technology as a tool, you often end up being a hammer looking for a nail. And what I'd much rather have people do is really get rooted in the problem. And technology is often can be an accelerator of a solution, but I'd rather you come up with a analog solution first that works really well, is really compelling, is something people really want, makes a big difference, can scale. And then technology is something that can accelerate that, can maybe get it to more people, can get it to people less expensively, and so forth. But if you start with the technology, I feel like oftentimes we get misled and get overly enamored with the app we're building or whatever, and forget about the people that we're really trying to reach. So I'm not a big fan of focusing on the technology, but and I think when it comes to technology in global development in particular, sometimes it's the simplest technologies that make the biggest difference. I mean, just the fact that people have internet access now, that is huge for a lot of people, to be able to, access job opportunities, access educational opportunities, get health information, get information about agricultural practices, and so forth. But yet, I think it's something still about half of the people in developing countries still don't have even internet access. There's a huge gulf there of a technology that is tried and true and works and has been around for a long time, but a lot of people don't have access to it. And in fact, women have a lot less access to the internet than men do in many countries. And so a lot of the inequities in just that basic access, I think, are really important to pay attention to. And then simple things like mobile money. There's mobile money systems such as in Kenya and Bangladesh and many other countries now that allow people to, for the first time, people who are living in extreme poverty for the first time, have something resembling a bank account where they can store their money safely, not just under their mattress. And be able to transfer money to their family members who may be, living in a different location, and be able to securely receive benefits. Those are, game-changing things for people that are in most cases based on very primitive just SMS technology. So I think one of the important things to think about with technology is it's not the latest and greatest whiz bang thing usually that makes the biggest difference. It really is kind of meeting people where they are, and looking at starting from the problem you're trying to solve and looking at how technology can be an accelerant for that.
Thank you for that clarification. And I agree that technology is a tool that we can use to, help, hopefully, make things more equitable, more balanced, more accessible. But of course, we see, and I know you have tons of research to prove this, that that's not happening, unfortunately, in many places. And speaking of access and equity, I want to move this conversation a little bit to, the fact that we are celebrating Pride in the global North. At least I'm in Argentina, and we celebrate. I think it's in November, so I get to celebrate twice, even though Pride is every day, in my opinion. Got to be proud every day. So let's move to speak about social innovation and how it might be applied to serve the LGBTQ plus community. Any words about that?
Yeah, I think that there's many challenges that we have faced in the past and we're continuing to face in the present, in the LGBTQ community, which I identify with, and and the tools for social innovation are very applicable here, right? Like, just to go backwards in history, when we were fighting for marriage equality, initially a lot of the efforts to do so were emphasizing rights. This is equal rights, civil rights, so forth. We should have the same rights as everybody else. And that message really wasn't getting a lot of traction. It wasn't really changing people's minds. And we learned that by testing messages and seeing, like, is this something people respond to? And not testing messages with ourselves, but testing messages with the people we're trying to actually reach and change their hearts and minds. And so through a process that resembles an innovation process, the folks who are doing this went about, both casting a wide net to come up with all sorts of different messages. Actually, they started out by listening to the audience of the people whose minds they're trying to reach, came up with a wide range of messages and messengers to see, to come up with a wide array of different possibilities, and then tested them to see what worked. And what they found is that what really worked was having people be relatable. So the message of love is love, and that these people love each other and they should be able to celebrate their love, like that, a much more personal message, or something that was meaningful to people. And also messages that came from unlikely suspects. It wasn't just the LGBTQ people giving the message, but other straight people who are veterans, people from religious backgrounds, were people that were more trusted messengers for them to be able to hear the message. So being able to, like, test these kinds of things, both listen to your customers, get a lot of different ideas, and then test them, really, I think, was part of the success of the movement for marriage equality. I think as we go forward, there's so many more challenges that we face. I think we need to take that same attitude, right? Is like, again, to try to avoid having too much hubris as a community, that we know the answers, and we just beat you over the head enough times so that you're going to agree with us. That's not really how it works. So we need to continue to be humble about what's the message that's going to work, in terms of changing hearts and minds, but also when it comes to services. I mean, LGBTQ people are disproportionately affected by many of the different things. Like, there's a disproportionate number of youth who are homeless. And so when we start looking at how do we provide better services for homeless youth, there again, the tools of social innovation, of listening to the youth, of coming up with a out of the box thinking to come up with better solutions, testing those solutions, seeing what works, and finding pathways to really scale, so that we're not just serving the 50 youth in our community, but that we are finding a way to serve youth across the country, at a scale that works, and also a way to address the root causes, so that we're not constantly trying to help a few people only to have more people face the same problem.
And the reality is, I mean, I love the micro and the macro vision that you speak of, because of course you're speaking about your immediate community, but then also when we speak about innovation and technology, I am in Argentina. I can see what is happening in your community, and that can, inspire me to do something, or, cause myself to reflect on something based on what I'm seeing there. So we are affecting everyone in the global community because we have, access to innovation and technology. I would love to hear your opinion on some resources that we can lean into as producers of technology and as consumers of technology. And I know I keep ringing on technology, but I find that it's very important in these times that, a lot of us are having to isolate, a lot of us are having to be on technology for work, or, to figure out how to celebrate, let's say, Pride, when mostly maybe sometimes we'd be out in the streets and we can't do that right now. And so we're having to find these like safe places online to celebrate, let's say, Pride. And unfortunately, there aren't a lot of safe queer spaces in the physical space and neither in the digital space. So I've just love to hear, how can we just be more mindful, and lean into resources, specifically with the LGBTQ plus community, to innovate, you know, equity. Let's just say equity. These are really huge questions that I'm asking you, but I feel like I want to just pull out as much information as I can in the small time that I have with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to give you the answer to solving equity on this in 45-minute chat. So I apologize for everyone if you're looking for that, but I'm sorry, I don't have the answer. What I do have, though, is a process and a how do we get to an answer? How do we get to an answer as fast as possible? In my book, I talk about 3 principles for social innovation: think big, start small, and relentlessly seek impact. And I think those really have stood the test of time in really grounding whatever problem we're trying to solve and whatever tools we're trying to use. That think big is basically start by being audacious, right? Like, don't just think, how do I help these 20 people in my community, but how do I transform the nature of the problem that I'm seeing in the world? And a lot of times I think we're not audacious enough. And when I think of audacious, I think 20 years out, think in your lifetime, what would you like on your gravestone that you would feel like it was success, right? Like, how would the world be different? Not just the people you helped along the way, but how would the world be different? So be really audacious, think further out. Because when we think, in a lot of times we're sort of asked to do these 3 to 5 year strategic plans, and they're just so short term that, like, even 3 to 5 years, you're not going to transform most things in that length of time. So think longer term about what transformation looks like in really concrete terms. It's like, if there's, we're going to try to reach 100x more people, or, whatever it is that we're trying to do. And then, and this is like the tension here that's hard, is the think big but start small. So on one hand, I'm asking people to stretch, to be more ambitious than they might be right now. But on the other hand, I'm asking people at the same time to start way smaller. So think 100 times bigger and start 100 times smaller than what you're doing today. And what I mean by that is, a lot of times when we come up with an idea, we start out by running a pilot. It's like, maybe the pilot takes tens, hundreds, thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, takes 6 months or a year. It's a lot of time to try something that we don't know is going to work or not. How do we instead start smaller? How do we start with an experiment or test, to test an assumption that might take an hour, maybe a day, maybe a week, and maybe take just a few $100s or a few $1,000s, that causes us to learn and eliminate paths that aren't going to work as early as possible, and double down on the paths that do show some promise, right? So that tension is really hard, but I think we need to think much bigger and start much smaller. And then the relentlessly seek impact is really like, we got to keep our eyes on the ball. Like, we can maybe start out going down the right path, but I see so many organizations after a while, they turn to self-perpetuation rather than really focusing on impact. And we need to exist to continue to have impact, but we need to put first and foremost, like, making the biggest change in the world. And sometimes that means letting go of our ideas and adopting another organization's ideas because they came up with something better. It might mean merging with another organization. It might mean taking some risks, but we need to stay relentlessly focused on making sure we are having the absolute biggest impact possible, and moving the needle towards that ambitious goal we set.
I love that. I have a personal story that I'd like to share. Speaking of ambitious goals, and this is very, like, I don't know, this has to do with the context of my life. So I'm in Patagonia right now, and I'm like, I want to see a condor, right? Good luck, right? The condors are a very rare sighting, and one of the biggest bird, if not the biggest bird, in the world. And so I go, okay, well, how do I do that? Maybe I'll just sit and wait for it. Let's see if that dream will come true if I sit and just have my binoculars and wait. Let's see if that dream will come true if I go to certain, points that I think it will be. And it ended up, in my experience, I needed to hike this, like, I think it was 4,000 meters, almost 5,000 meter mountain, one step at a time, right? So taking this big ambitious goal of seeing a condor, but having to literally take one step at a time, 3 hours to get to the top, and then I could see it. I wasn't expecting at that time, but I was like, oh, okay, I needed to do this. I needed to take. I mean, I felt like I almost died getting to the top of that mountain. I had vertigo and everything. But it was that every step counts. And I know this might sound cliche, but it's just to your point. Have these big ambitious goals, but start small, take one step and see what happens, and be willing to shift at your experiments. And maybe if sitting on my ass and having binoculars looking at the sky doesn't work, well, let me get off my ass and try to get up that mountain. I'm not going to like blink my eyes and get to the top of the mountain either. I'm going to do that one step at a time. So thank you for that reminder, and it just had me reflect on that moment. Okay, let's talk about money and funding. So, can you tell us a bit more about how nonprofits secure funding for innovation, or how for-profit social enterprises secure impact investment dollars?
Yeah, so funding is one of the biggest obstacles to innovation in the social sector. I hear over and over again when I talk about social innovation, almost always the first question I get is like, that sounds great, I want to do it, but like I've got all these grants that are restricted, and there are certain things I promised to do, and I have to do those things, and I don't know how I'm going to have the time to innovate. Like I can't do it. And a lot of nonprofits are trapped in that cycle, right? I call it like the hamster wheel, where what you're doing is you're writing grants, you're winning grants, and you're implementing grants, and then at the same time you're writing more grants so you can continue to get the money in the door. But then your hands are tied, where you got to do all the things you've agreed to in the grant. And so I think that is a cycle that works if you're providing services that you think that work, that are in have a renewable source of funding that can scale. But for most of us working in the nonprofit sector, the reason the nonprofit sector exists is because things aren't working. There's something not working, which is why we need the nonprofit sector. And so where we need much better solutions, I think we just need to take a different approach, right? And so that requires us to have both the flexibility, the agility, and the risk appetite to be able to find those better solutions. And that requires different kinds of funding. And so the ways that there's many ways you can get there. Some of them are easier than others. For organizations that do have some amount of unrestricted funding, rather than just plowing it back into doing more of a traditional program, how about taking some of it aside and using it to innovate, to try to figure out how to make your program dramatically better. One of the mistakes people make when they think about innovation is they think it's expensive. Like it's got to be really expensive to kick off a new innovation initiative. But in fact, it should not be expensive. I talked earlier about start small. You should be able to start with just a few $100s, a few hours, and try something different that may be radically different, that could be transformative. And if you hit one that looks like it's promising, you get some preliminary data to say it's promising, then you have something you can go to funders to say, hey, we tried this with 5 people and it looked kind of interesting. Will you let us, give us money to try with 100, right? And that's a much easier ask to make. But if you don't have that flexibility, even with your even a small amount of funding within your own bank account, which many organizations don't, then I think another easy entry point is when you write those grants, when you inevitably are writing the grants to provide services that you've done before, include an innovation window in that grant. So just say 95% of the funds I am going to be housing homeless youth, but 5% of the funds, what I'm going to do is figure out how to do that better. I'm going to figure out how to do it less expensively. I'm going to figure out new revenue streams. I'm going to figure out how to have better outcomes so that more of the youth get jobs at the end, or whatever it is. I am going to try to do something to make it better. And I think, not every funder is going to go for that, but I think that vast majority would, right? You're not talking about not doing any things that they want. You're just talking about carving out a small amount of money to make it better. And so that's another way to do it, where it's still in the structure of you're getting grants and you're implementing those grants, but you're giving yourself a little bit room in that grant to try to figure out something new. And then the final avenue is to raise money specifically for innovation. And that can be sometimes from high net worth individuals. It can be sometimes by writing grants to organizations, foundations that do innovation funding. So you're deliberately asking for money for innovation. And again, really encourage you to start small. Like ask for a grant that's a few $1,000s that gets you started to try something out, and then ask for more only when you start seeing traction. I think, again, the mistake there is we often ask for too much before we even know what's going to work.
And you're hitting a little bit on the next question that I want to ask that was submitted previous to this conversation, but just give us a reminder here. What are some key metrics to look out for, and maybe also highlight some barriers that most companies face?
Yeah, so one a new terminology that I've been using recently. I just wrote a piece in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and it's based on a Bain concept in the Bain Consulting in the private sector. They call it Engine One and Engine Two. So if you think of like the classic example is like Kodak, right? Kodak had their Engine One; they were making film and film cameras and processing film, and they knew how to do that. They were the best in class. They were doing it. But meanwhile, everybody else is starting to move to digital. And what Kodak didn't do is invest in their engine two, which was this transformation to digital soon enough. And so they eventually got taken over and fell behind, right? And so in the social sector, we have the same challenge, which is there's our engine one and our engine two. The engine one is probably whatever program you're running today that does some good. You know, you're seeing results in the community, but it's probably not doing enough good to be transformative in the fullness of time to have the degree of change we want and to reach as many people as we want. And so we need to look at different metrics for our engine one and our engine two. For our engine one, where you have something that's proven that you just are turning the crank on, you're trying to do as much of it as you can, that's where it's reasonable to count how many people you've reached, how many times you've turned the crank essentially. For engine two, we don't know what's going to work. We're trying to find something that's going to work much better. And so one of the biggest mistakes I see us make is that when we're trying to invest in an engine two, when we're trying to design something new, we're also counting the number of people we reach. But counting the number of people you reach makes no sense when you don't have something that you know works, right? So who cares that you reach a bunch of people with something that doesn't work? So what we want to do instead for an engine two, or for innovation in general, is rather than focusing on the number of people we reach, we want to focus on unit metrics that show us how effective it is. Is it better? And I divide those up into three buckets of value, growth, and impact. So value is this something people want, will come back for, it really meets a deeply felt need? So do you have a high engagement rate? If you're trying to reach youth, are they showing up? Are they participating? Are they like staying involved? Impact then is, does it work? So is it making the difference that you're looking for? Is it helping people increase their incomes? Is it helping improve equity? Whatever the thing is it actually working? And then if you have something that people want and it works, that's great, but we can't stop there. Then we have to figure out how it's going to get to everyone, right? How is it going to really make change at the scale of the need? And so we also need to think about metrics around growth, which is, what are your unit costs? What kind of revenue stream do you have? Do you have a way to, how complicated is your intervention? Is something that can be easily replicated? And so when we are innovating, what we want to do is focus on those unit metrics around value, growth, and impact to see, are we improving the engagement? Are we increasing the success rate? Are we decreasing the cost? Because overall, the shorthand for that is if you can find a way to make your solution dramatically more cost effective, you're going to make a bigger difference to more people.
I love that you are highlighting, following up, following through, making sure that you're not just, lip servicing, right? You're practicing what you preach, and making sure that, true impact is being made. What's a flag that we can look out for as consumers, to really make sure that, the company or the organization is having that impact that they say that they want to have? And I say this because, especially with the existence of, let's say, social media and how it is transformed today, and how it is, very accessible depending on where you are, who you are. We have a lot of folks who are tagging on to, the need for diversity and inclusion, and, depending on the month and what we're celebrating, they want to let people know that they are interested in making an impact in these spaces. But how do we really know? How can we hold these organizations accountable, as consumers?
Yeah, that's a great question, and really something that's very timely these days. I think a lot of people are thinking about this topic. And sadly, what I've seen is that the vast majority of these, social impact efforts by companies end up being predominantly driven by PR, right? That the company wants to look good. They're signaling, virtue signaling, right? And the reason I say that is that what I've seen is that while companies may indeed be investing their time and their resources and their money in doing something that is good, that is helping a particular community, they don't take the result of that or their effectiveness there as seriously as they do their core business, right? So a company might say be relentlessly competing with all their other competitors along their core business to be the very best and to have the most cost effective solution, and they're just relentlessly making that better. And then on the other hand, they're like trying to improve homelessness in their community, right? And they write a bunch of checks, they maybe do some employee like service work or whatever, but they're not relentlessly like going, is this fixing homelessness, or has the homeless rate gone down, are you finding a way to help more people with less money? Like are they really being able to are they really solving the problem? First of all, is not, are they not just doing something, but are they solving the problem, or seeming like they're on track to solve the problem? And are they really focused on getting better and better and better, and not just kind of putting writing a check?
And something that I find, like when I started to live in Argentina full time, coming from the States and coming from California specifically, there was a initiative that really called my attention living in the States. And then when I came to Argentina, I could see that no one really knew about this initiative, even though they like were speaking about, how they were helping folks in Argentina who didn't have basically shoes, and every shoe that you bought, we would give another shoe to this Argentine person that, couldn't afford shoes. And then I would come here and ask people in Argentina, do you know about this initiative? And they would say no. Um, and actually, when I started to speak about it, they were like, these people don't need shoes, they need food, they need,
Yeah.
work. And
Yeah.
so it's just, I wanted to ask that question just to know, like, how can we be more responsible as we are, as we are supporting these social impact movements within an organization or within a company, to know that this isn't just a self-righteous impact solution. Like, they aren't doing it for themselves to make themselves feel better, that they are actually impacting the people that they say that they are. And it
Yeah.
shouldn't have to take someone going to another country to see if that's truly happening or not. So just, how to just put our antennas up and to be able to smell when something is foul or when it's right, to be able to support that full on.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in the shoes example, I don't know if this was the case in the example you used, but Tom's Shoes actually is a great example of this. In their early days, I think they were the pioneers of the buy one, give one, right? You buy a pair of shoes, we're going to give a pair of shoes to the community. And they did this for many years, and, got a lot of press attention for it, got a lot of virtue from like, hey, we're helping these poor communities. But then, to their credit, they did a study to see, like, is this working? Is it helping these communities? Because their messaging was, we give shoes to these poor kids, it's going to help them improve their lives and improve their incomes and education and all this kind of stuff. When they did the study, they found out that that wasn't actually happening. It wasn't like to your point, they needed food, they needed education, they didn't necessarily need shoes. Um, but even more so, by giving shoes to one community one year, another community another year, they put all the shoe manufacturers locally out of business. And then, so it was actually, and they were creating this sort of cycle of dependency that was actually making things worse, right? And again, to their credit, they did a study where they uncovered this and then shifted their practices to do more about look, so that they now do go into communities and understand what the communities need. They are trying to do things in a sustainable way where they help, are sourcing locally and all of that kind of stuff. But I think it's a really great example of how we need to ask the question of people. As we started this conversation, we need to listen and understand what people's problems really are, not what we think their problems are. We need to have them be part of designing a solution. Then we need to really look at the right metrics to say, is this working? Not just, did I do stuff? Did I give out shoes? Like everybody celebrates, oh, I gave out this many shoes, like great. But what was the result of that? We need to also look at that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you reflecting on that with me, just so that we can all be, more mindful, more responsible. And I love that you're bringing up the fact that, to their credit, they did tests, they did research, and then they tried to modify to. I don't know I don't know how Tom's is doing now, but I do appreciate you bringing up the fact that, it takes, you implement a strategy and then you check back in to see if it's actually working, and then you readjust and you stay flexible, because we're always changing all of the time. Every day is different. So, why would you keep something static when the world is always changing? So we've got about 2 minutes left. I'm going to read you a little meaty quote, and I would just love to hear your reflection on this. This comes back to just, for someone who has something that they want to innovate, and they're seeking funding, the realness of, not having that support and being underrepresented, puts a barrier there for some folks, for people of color, for queer folks. So I'm going to read this. This comes from Urban Geeks, and it speaks to investments. So the overwhelmingly majority of VCs continue to invest in younger versions of themselves. In fact, most venture-backed startups are overwhelmingly white, male, Ivy League educated, and based in Silicon Valley, according to a recent study conducted jointly by Diversity VC and Rate My Investor. What are your thoughts on this?
I think that's absolutely true, and it continues to be true, sadly. I at one point took a team of mine when I was working at a nonprofit to one of the top venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, so that we could learn how to take some of these practices that they use in the venture capital space towards social good. And the venture capitalist we happened to speak to was a white man, and one of the things he said to me, which just stuck with me, was, everybody who is, who has a great idea is likely just one step removed from knowing one of us. Like, that is not the case. like maybe if they went to Stanford and they whatever, but that is not the case. But I think that we both need to have the people who are in those positions really recognize that they don't actually know people across the spectrum of folks who might have good ideas, but also to have more people in those positions who do know people and who do come from different experiences, in order for us to develop this solution, the best solutions that are going to be compelling, to both be successful financially and make a big difference socially.
Thank you so much. I wanted to throw that one in because I'm reading it recently, and I'm just like, I want to ask as many people as I can what they think about this, to see if we can maybe just change that energy a little bit. So Ann Mei, thank you so much for spending time with me today. I know you have to jump to some more meetings. How can we support the work that you're doing? Where can we find you online? Because I personally want to continue to support the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you. For anyone who wants to learn more about Lean Impact, you can read my book, or you come to my website, leanimpact.org, and find out more about myself and the book. And you can also contact me directly through the website. You can also follow me on Twitter at Ann Mei, ANNMEI.
Thank you so much, Ann Mei. I appreciate you. Meg, I'm going to pass the mic back to you. And the whole summit has been very moving. So I'm just honored to be able to facilitate these conversations with you all. Thank you so much.